Casey Reed, a high school senior from a backwoods town in Oregon, had never really attracted much attention. She was just an ordinary girl, dark, slightly curly hair, big eyes with a dreamy glint in them. Her world was sedate, if not boring school, the occasional hangout with her classmates, evenings at home where her parents were too busy to notice her. Her loneliness was exacerbated by the realization that she wasn't like the others. While her friends discussed college plans or dreamed of the future, Casey couldn't decide what she wanted for herself. On the evening that changed her life, she was walking back through the city park. The park was one of those places that seemed gloomy and desolate at times, especially as darkness fell. The streetlights here flickered and tree branches loomed in threatening shadows. Casey walked quickly, trying to ignore the rustles and barely audible voices behind her. She spotted them when it was too late. 3 guys, local boys who usually hung around the old buildings, were coming out to meet her. Her heart sank when she realized they were walking straight towards her. Casey tried to step around them, but one of them took a step forward and smirked, eyeing her appraisingly. "Hey, pretty lady, where are you going?" he said with a chuckle, squinting his eyes. She tried to back away, but her legs felt like cotton, and her words stuck in her throat. Suddenly, as if by magic, a figure appeared in the shadows. A tall man, with a determined expression and a look that made the boys immediately back away. "Is something wrong, boys?" he asked calmly, but there was a warning in his voice. The guys looked at each other and, realizing that the force was clearly not on their side, turned around and quickly disappeared into the darkness. Casey couldn't take her eyes off her savior. The man approached her, his figure looming in the lantern light. Sturdy, trim in his 30s, with close-cropped blonde hair and a piercing look in his gray-blue eyes. "Is everything all right?" he asked softly, looking her over. Casey nodded, trying not to look him in the eye, but her heart was beating like crazy. "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you," she mumbled, not knowing where to look. "Call me Douglas," he said, smiling slightly. Or just Doug. She noticed the badge on his uniform and realized she was a cop. There was something strange and delightful about it. Her savior, so strong and confident, was an officer. Douglas must have noticed her interest, but he remained calm. "Be careful," he advised. "It's not as safe as it looks in the evening." Casey nodded, feeling her cheeks flaming. She couldn't believe that only a few minutes ago she'd been on the verge of panic. But now she was feeling something completely new, a strange sense of calm and even awe. Douglas stared at her until she disappeared around the corner and stood staring into the void for a long time. Since then, Casey had found herself thinking about that night more and more often. Douglas had become a hero to her, someone who had appeared out of nowhere and saved her. She knew he was a cop, but she didn't need to know more. His silent but calm presence was a vivid enough memory. From time to time, when she passed by the police station, she tried to catch a glimpse of him, but she rarely succeeded. However, her interest in him grew every day, even though she realized how strange and a little naive it all was. She shared her impression with Hannah, her only close friend, who always listened to her with a slight irony. Hannah was pragmatic, a little harsh, and even cynical for her age. She listened to the story about the policeman, but only shook her head. "He probably doesn't remember saving you anymore, Casey. Forget it," she said, noticing the dreamy look in her eyes. "He's a grown man. What do you expect?" Casey tried not to react to such words, but something in Hannah's words awakened reality and made her come down to earth. But inside her smoldered a hope, albeit a crazy one, that Douglas was the one who would understand her best. Douglas Harris lived the ordinary life of a provincial policeman. A job, sometimes routine, sometimes demanding, where you sometimes encounter trouble and the cruelty of the world. He knew that his profession imposed certain obligations, and he was not hard on himself for that. But with each passing year, he felt that his life was not giving him the joy and fullness he sought. Sometimes it seemed to him that time was passing by, and he was only watching the world change while he remained where he was. One night, he was sitting in a bar with his friend and partner Sam Miller. with whom they had worked side by side for years. Sam was the complete opposite of him. Open, outgoing, with a flair for irony and a constant desire to make conversation. They often talked about anything and everything, and Douglas liked that friendly shoulder to lean on. "Saw you with some girl in the park," Sam teased him, setting down his beer bottle. "What are you playing, Savior?" "It was just an accident," Douglas said, not wanting to go into details. "The girl was sick, so what's the big deal?" Sam laughed, but looked at his friend as if he saw something beyond his explanation. "Have you ever wondered if your life is becoming like working without rest?" he asked after a pause. Douglas only shrugged his shoulders. He didn't want to admit that perhaps his life was really only limited by duty. He didn't know that soon this very feeling would lead him to a step that would change his destiny forever. Thus began a story that for both characters became a turning point in their lives. After that meeting in the park, Casey could not get Douglas out of her head. She caught herself dreaming of him as a prince from a fairy tale who saved her from darkness. In her mind, he was a noble hero, strong, intelligent, and determined. More and more often, she found an excuse to walk past the police station, catch a glimpse of him inside, and occasionally, she would catch a glimpse of him talking to his coworkers or immersed in his work. It was several weeks before fate brought them together again. Casey was walking through the park after school when she spotted Douglas again. He was standing by the fountain, holding his cell phone in his hand and reading something on the screen. Her heart raced faster and she summoned up all her courage and walked over to him. "Hello," she said timidly. Douglas looked up, surprised for a moment, but immediately recognized her and softened. He couldn't help but remember the incident with the bullies and notice how her face had brightened at the sight of him. Part of him was wary. He knew it was inappropriate to be interested in a girl of that age, but her open, sincere face and childlike affection for him stirred something warm and long forgotten in his soul. He was suddenly glad to have the attention, shackled by the routine of work and the constraints of duty. "Hi, Casey," he said, smiling slightly. "How's it going?" The conversation was awkward, but it didn't last long. When Casey was about to leave, he offered to walk her home. It was that walk, that conversation alone, that was the beginning of their strange relationship. They began to meet again, secretly, covertly, far away from the eyes of people who might suspect something. Each meeting was full of trepidation, but also of fear. Douglas kept reminding himself that this was unacceptable, that he was risking everything he had, but he couldn't stop. At first, everything was innocent. Short conversations, walks along deserted streets, trips to cafes on the outskirts of the city. Casey told him about her life, her school, her friends, how she dreamed of leaving the town and becoming an artist. Her honesty, openness, and childlike optimism touched him. She seemed to him a breath of fresh air, something bright and warm, which he did not even suspect in his routine. As time passed, he began to realize that their meetings were not destined to remain secret for long. Her naivety and the ardor with which she made plans for their future made him nervous. He sensed that she was beginning to insist on something more, and it reminded him more and more that their relationship was a forbidden fruit that could eventually turn disastrous. But he was hesitant to break the attachment, knowing that she needed him too. Douglas tried to be careful. He realized that his job left no room for such actions, and that his colleagues, accidentally finding out about Casey, would not forgive him for this blunder. His best friend and partner Sam looked at him suspiciously at times, noticing his frequent absences and odd looks. Sam was smart and perceptive, though he tried to stay out of Douglas's personal affairs. But Douglas knew that if he accidentally let it slip or was careless, Sam would instantly guess what was going on. The situation became especially complicated when Casey, overwhelmed with emotion, wrote him a note confessing her love and handed it to him when they met. After reading it, Douglas felt on the verge of a cliffhanger. The note was sincere and naive. She described him as the only one who had ever understood her, who saw her for what she was, without judgment or criticism. She wrote that she loved him with all her heart and dreamed of being with him always. Douglas, holding this note in his hands, realized for the first time the depth of her affection and his responsibility. He knew that at any moment the situation could come to light, and then his life would be ruined. He needed to stop it. But he couldn't deny himself the rare meetings with her, the feeling that someone really saw him not only as a cop, but as a human being. As time went on, their meetings became more and more secretive and tense. Douglas avoided places where he might accidentally run into coworkers or acquaintances and suggested that Casey come to places where no one would see them. At one point, they started meeting in an old warehouse that had long been abandoned, and no one ever looked in there. The place was dark and gloomy, but they could be alone there. Every time he went there, fear gripped him. He realized that the place and the situation itself was dangerous to his reputation, and every time he left the warehouse, he reassured himself that he wouldn't go back. But Casey was waiting for him, and he couldn't leave her alone. She kept writing to him, making more and more insistent confessions, and it made him feel trapped in a cage he'd created himself. For Casey, these meetings became the real meaning of life. She waited every day for the moment when she could see him, tell him about her new dreams and plans. She didn't realize that her love was putting him in a dangerous position. Her view of the world was simple and straightforward. She believed that they could be together, that love would overcome everything. She even started making plans for the future, imagining them moving away together one day, starting a new life. Her friend Hannah was the first to notice how Casey's behavior changed. She became more dreamy, sometimes withdrawn, as if immersed in some secret thought. One day, Hannah asked her if she was in love. Casey blushed and looked away but didn't deny it. Hannah tried to find out who he was, but Casey just smiled and said a little shyly, "It doesn't matter. You wouldn't understand." Hannah frowned, sensing something wasn't right here, but left her friend alone. She didn't know that these meetings with Douglas were becoming almost an obsession for Casey that she couldn't give up. One evening, on his way home from another meeting with Casey, Douglas saw Sam standing by the lot, smoking and gazing thoughtfully into the distance. Douglas lingered, trying to conceal his presence, but Sam noticed him. "Late coming back, buddy," he said, glancing at Douglas. "Tough day?" "Yeah, stuff happens," Douglas answered evasively, feeling his palms sweat. Since they'd started dating, Casey's life had taken on a completely different color. Her days weren't spent in mindless classes or chatting with her classmates. Every spare moment was devoted to thinking about Douglas. He had become her secret passion, and though her inner voice sometimes warned her of danger, Casey couldn't stop herself. Their meetings became more frequent and more personal. At first it was just walks and quiet conversations, but each time their connection grew deeper and more physically tangible. Douglas, though he tried to keep his distance, still gave in to the attraction that had developed between them. He knew he was doing the wrong thing, but her burning touch, her tender and trusting affection, had awakened feelings in him that he had long forgotten. Now their meetings were no longer limited to secret walks. They began to spend time in secluded places where they could be truly intimate. In an abandoned warehouse, they were hiding from prying eyes, and Casey, completely surrendering to her feelings, believed that they were truly in love. She was no longer afraid of the feeling, and he couldn't resist her sincere youth. Hannah noticed the change in Casey almost immediately. They went to the same school and often sat together at recess, talking about everything in the world. Lately, however, Hannah had seen her friend more and more often staring at a small diary. Casey wrote in it with her head bowed low, hiding the contents of the pages from anyone who might accidentally peek at her notes. "What's in there?" Hannah asked once, trying to peer over her shoulder. Casey instantly closed the journal as if she'd been caught doing something inappropriate. She was embarrassed and tried to turn the conversation around, but Hannah wouldn't back down. "You've become kind of mysterious," Hannah said with a slight smile, but there was interest in her eyes. "Are you sure you're not seeing anyone?" Casey blushed and looked away, trying to hide her excitement. "It's just my thoughts. Sometimes I write down what comes into my head," she replied, pretending it wasn't important. Hannah just shook her head, thinking to herself that her friend was clearly having an affair. What she didn't know was that Casey wrote everything in that diary. Their secret meetings, his tender words, every look and touch that meant more to her than she could admit. She wrote down her feelings, made plans, dreamed of a future where they would be together as if his age and profession didn't matter. Each encounter heightened Douglas's fear and excitement, but he couldn't stop. Casey grew bolder and more insistent, as if it were a normal story with nothing forbidden. An uneasiness was building in his mind. He was well aware of where their liaison might lead. But her touch, her fragility, and at the same time the ardor with which she gave herself to him, kept him from giving up this passion. He forgot everything when they were together, and the world with its rules seemed distant and non-existent. Still, his anxiety grew, and one day he tried to have a serious talk with her. "Casey," he began, looking at her with grim determination, "we must be careful. No one must find out about this. Do you realize what would happen if we were exposed?" She squeezed his hand, looking into his face with naive earnestness. "I won't tell anyone, I promise. But why does it have to be a secret? Is what we're feeling wrong?" She asked so sincerely that he felt hurt. He had nothing to answer. To her it was just love, something light and simple, and he, a grown man, felt the gravity of the situation. He should have stopped it. But instead, he pulled her to him and kissed her, knowing he would only make it worse. The fall evening was cold. The wind blew yellow leaves across the deserted streets, and the abandoned warehouse seemed even more bleak and isolated. Casey sat on an old crate, clutching her phone in her hands, staring into the darkness where Douglas's silhouette appeared. He froze at the doorway, his face tense and his gaze anxious. He'd been avoiding her calls and messages for days, and it was only when Casey said she needed to talk to him urgently that he finally agreed to come. "Casey," he said quietly, stopping at a distance. He felt a strange mixture of relief and fear wash over him when he saw her. Whatever she had to say, he knew it would be something important. She stood before him, pale and focused, looking into his eyes in a way she never had before. Finally, gathering her resolve, Casey broke the silence. "Douglas, I'm pregnant." His heart seemed to stop for several long seconds. The world around him froze, and he felt the blood rush from his face. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to react. It seemed that all his fears, all the anxieties of the last few months were embodied in that simple but sizzling confession. She waited for a response, but it was as if his mind was paralyzed. He saw her so fragile and confused and couldn't find the words. "Are you sure?" he finally muttered, feeling his throat go dry. Casey nodded, looking at him with childlike hope. "Yes, Douglas, I'm sure." Her voice was shaky, but there was a strange joy in her eyes, as if she believed they could get through this together. He took a step back, as if trying to pull away not only physically, but mentally as well. The words stuck in his throat. His career, his reputation, the law, his life, all of it was instantly jeopardized. "We need to stop, Casey." His voice was low and cold. He wouldn't look her in the eye. This is impossible. Do you realize that this is ruining everything? This is the end." Her face paled even more, a grin trembling on her lips that she tried to hold back, but tears were already coming to her eyes. "The end? Are you serious?" Her voice sounded like a broken whisper. "You're willing to leave me now, when we have a baby?" He clenched his fists, fighting the guilt, but he couldn't change his mind. His fear was too great, the responsibility too overwhelming. He realized that even the slightest spark of hope would only prolong the agony he could no longer control. "Casey, listen, we can't keep this. It's a mistake," he cut her off without looking at her. "No one can know, do you understand? No one." She recoiled as if he'd hit her, and stood in front of him, unable to believe her ears. Something dark and piercing flashed in her gaze, like rejection, as if all the love she had lived so devotedly for had been shattered in an instant. "You just want to run away? You want me to pretend it never happened?" Casey raised her voice, tears and pain glistening in her eyes. "You never loved me, did you? I'm just a girl for you to use and throw away like a toy." Douglas tried to touch her hand, but she pulled away, her gaze icy. He saw the warmth in her eyes fade, her face harden, and knew there was no turning back. "Go away," she said, pulling away from him. "If this is a mistake for you, then live with it yourself." With those words, Casey turned abruptly, heading for the exit. Douglas hurried after her, his voice shaking with confusion and fear. "Casey, wait!" he called out, trying to hold her back. "Let's talk about this. I'm just not ready." She stopped abruptly and turned around, her eyes glistening with tears, and he felt a shiver run through his body. She didn't just look angry, she looked disappointed, almost hateful. She'd told him about their future, about the baby, but all he could see were his own fears and dangers that couldn't be part of her naive love. "You're not ready then?" she said in a low voice, her voice trailing off into a hoarse whisper. "You know, Douglas, I don't care about your fears. I'm not going to hide. If you don't understand that, then you're not the man I loved." With those words, Casey turned and rushed for the exit, but he, driven by a flash of desperation and anger, grabbed her arm, preventing her from leaving. She tried to break free, but he held her tightly, and his breathing became heavy and intermittent. Their quarrel was spreading like a fire, fast, uncontrollable, blinding. Casey, desperate to free herself, broke free for a moment, but he grabbed her again, and they found themselves in a dark corner of the warehouse. Her voice faded, followed by an ominous, deadening moment of silence. She'd been found by accident. The body lay in the back of the old warehouse, the same place they'd often met. Some of the local teenagers who had wandered in there for adrenaline and adventure had stumbled upon the body and ran out of the building screaming. The news of Casey's death came as a shock to everyone. In a small town where almost everyone knew each other, such a tragedy stirred minds and raised a wave of speculation. Douglas, as well as other police officers, was called to the scene. When he saw the body, he was overcome with a horror like he had never felt before. He knew that part of the blame for her fate lay with him, that perhaps if he had acted differently, she would still be alive. His colleagues suspected nothing, but there was a guilt in his gaze that he could not hide. Soon experienced detectives from a large department, Lily Carter and Tom Garcia. Both of them were professionals in their field and were known for their methodology and attention to detail. Lily Carter, a woman in her 40s with a cold gaze and shrewd mind, had the skill to notice the slightest deviations in the behavior of interlocutors, which made her almost frightening during the interrogation. Tom Garcia, her partner, a little younger and outwardly more friendly, acted more gently, but his observation and ability to draw a general picture of what is happening was not inferior to the skills of her partner. The first stage of the investigation was simple: interviewing relatives, friends, and family. Lily and Tom realized that in small towns, such dramas were rarely without a trace of personal conflict. Casey was a young and beautiful girl, and motives could range from jealousy to revenge. First, they talked to Casey's parents, who were shocked and depressed. They knew little about her personal life. Her father worked at a local factory, her mother ran the household and rarely left the house. Casey was a quiet and obedient daughter, and for them her death was an unexpected and inexplicable blow. However, Casey's mother mentioned that she had noticed some oddities in her daughter's behavior in recent months. Casey started staying out late more often, secluded herself, and sometimes looked pensive, as if something was weighing on her. She answered her parents' questions evasively. The detectives then turned to her classmate, Hannah. She came in for questioning with noticeable agitation and anxiety. Lily Carter asked her in a soft voice about Casey's last few days, and Hannah, gradually opening up, revealed that her friend had been acting very strangely lately. She was particularly alarmed by the way Casey had been secretive, constantly writing in her diary and keeping it as her greatest secret. "Did you know she kept a diary?" Lily asked, squinting. "Yes," Hannah nodded. "She was always writing things down, but she never showed me. I tried to ask her, but she kept getting embarrassed and dismissing it. She also often said that she wanted to finally live freely and that her life was about to change." These words made Lily think. The notebook could be important evidence, and Lily asked the police to check Casey's house for a diary that might shed light on her last days. Meanwhile, detectives took a statement from Douglas Harris, one of the local department officers who had been at the scene. Outwardly, he remained calm, but Lily noticed a slight tension in his voice as he recounted his actions that day. "Did you know her?" Lily asked suddenly, watching his reaction carefully. Douglas hesitated for a moment, but quickly found an answer. "We met a couple times when I was on patrol. She was one of the local girls, nothing out of the ordinary." Lily noted in her notebook, however, the slight confusion in his voice. Tom, listening to the conversation from the sidelines, sensed that something in Douglas's demeanor seemed alarming, as if he were trying to hide true feelings. Douglas avoided making eye contact with the detectives. His answers were short, as if he were trying to say as little as possible. After the detectives left, Sam, his best friend and colleague, noticed Douglas's behavior. They had known each other for years, and Sam sensed that something was wrong with his friend. Douglas looked depressed, almost sick, and although he put it down to the stress of work, Sam couldn't shake the suspicion. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked him one night when it was just the two of them at the station. "Yeah, just tired," Douglas mumbled, averting his eyes. Sam was silent, but he noted to himself that such behavior was unusual for him. It hadn't occurred to him that Douglas might be connected to the Casey case, but his concern was growing. A couple days later, the police managed to find Casey's diary hidden in her room under her mattress. Lily Carter carefully opened it and began to read it, flipping through the pages. The entries were intense and emotional. In them, Casey described her encounters with someone she referred to simply as he. There were passages in the diary that Lily immediately singled out as important. "Today he said we have to be more careful. He's afraid someone will find out about us. But I know I love him and would do anything to keep us together. He looks scared sometimes. I think it's all his job. It requires caution, but can love be a crime?" Casey's words were full of hope and fear. Lily reread those lines once more, realizing that the girl was clearly in a secret relationship with someone who feared for her reputation. There were more intriguing phrases in the diary. "Today we met again at the warehouse. No one can see us there, and I am happy. He says he's afraid for both of us, but I think it's temporary. I know he loves me." The word warehouse in Casey's notes confirmed for Lily that this was the place that was significant in her life and probably served as a secret meeting place with her lover. Now it gave the detectives new leads. The diary indicated that the meetings at the warehouse were no coincidence, and it was likely that other clues might remain there that would help reveal the nature of Casey's relationship with her mysterious companion. Lily and Tom began to piece together a picture of her relationship. It became clear to them that Casey was dating someone who was likely older than her and someone respected, perhaps even a police officer. Details like that made the case even more complicated and explosive. Lily knew that one wrong move could cause a huge scandal, especially if their hunches were correct. As the investigation progressed, Douglas became increasingly nervous. At the station and at home, he tried to behave as usual, but he constantly felt tense and caught himself thinking more often than not about that very evening at the warehouse. Sam continued to suspect that something was wrong with his friend, and his anxiety was growing. At this point, the detectives weren't yet sure exactly who Casey's secret lover might have been, but they felt they were getting closer and closer to the truth. Lily and Tom were in the morgue, their faces tense. Dr. Wilson, the pathologist, took off his glasses and looked across the table at them. His face seemed tired, as if the words he was about to utter were difficult for him to say. "Well, Doc?" Tom asked, breaking the lingering silence. The doctor nodded, adjusting the collar of his white coat, and sighed. "I have something that might change the course of the investigation," he began cautiously. "Casey was pregnant." Lily and Tom exchanged quick glances. Tom frowned, his face growing grim. "How long?" Lily asked, trying not to let her emotions show. "A short time, just a few weeks. It's barely noticeable unless you look closely," the doctor replied. "But it's enough to run a paternity test." Lily pondered, her thoughts frantically spinning around the new possibilities. If Casey was pregnant, that opened up an entirely different motive for murder. Someone in the neighborhood, possibly an adult, was in a close relationship with her, she said, as if summarizing. "We should get DNA samples from male acquaintances. We should also request samples from the police officers who worked the case. That could lead us to the child's father." Dr. Wilson nodded in agreement, and Lily turned to Tom. "Prepare a request for DNA testing," she said as she headed for the exit. Tom followed her, and they quickly left the morgue. Lily was already imagining how the next development might lead them to the killer. While the DNA analysis was being done, Lily and Tom decided to revisit the warehouse where Casey's body had been found. At first, the place had seemed lifeless and empty, but now they studied it from a different angle, imagining that this was where their meetings might have taken place. Tom walked along the wall, studying the footprints on the floor, while Lily stopped at the wooden pallets where they apparently often sat. On one of the pallets, she noticed something unusual, small fibers of a dark blue color, almost indistinguishable at first glance. "Look, Tom," she pointed to it. Tom moved closer and squinted. "It looks like cloth," he said. "Maybe it's from clothing, or from a uniform?" Lily nodded, her thoughts focusing on that hint. If it really was fibers from the uniform, it would confirm that Casey was having an affair with one of the cops. She carefully packed the sample into a plastic bag. "It's not proof yet, but it's something," she remarked as she continued her examination. In the corner, closer to the wall, they also found some shoe prints. Tom took note of them so he could compare them with the samples at the police station. Something important was clearly going on in that warehouse, and now Lily had no doubt that the case was more complicated than it seemed at first glance. A few days later, the results of the DNA test came back. Lily and Tom were sitting in the station when a printout was placed in front of them. Tom swore to himself when he saw the last name, but Lily remained impassive, though her eyes betrayed surprise. The DNA matched the samples from Douglas Harris. "So we have a father," Tom said, studying the paper thoughtfully. "Yes, and he's a police officer," Lily added quietly. "Douglas Harris. His behavior in the interrogation was suspicious, but I didn't think it was that bad. They had to go to Douglas and confront him with the evidence. It wasn't the most pleasant task, accusing a colleague of having an affair with a minor. But Lily knew she couldn't let her personal feelings interfere with the case. They arrived at the station, and when Douglas saw them, his face petrified. Lily motioned for him to go to a separate office to talk. Douglas sat down at the desk, trying to remain calm, but Lily could see how tense he was, how his fingers twitched slightly. "We got the DNA results back, Douglas," Lily began bluntly. "You're the father of Casey Reed's baby." He closed his eyes and sighed, as if finally acknowledging something he'd been trying to run away from for so long. "Yes," he answered quietly. "I was with her." Douglas sat without raising his eyes, as if the admission required the last of his strength. Lily and Tom watched him carefully, each with his own approach. Lily coldly and shrewdly, Tom more restrained, though his gaze betrayed irritation. "Tell us everything, Douglas," Lily said demandingly, crossing her arms over her chest. "This whole thing with Casey, how long ago did it start? What happened between you two?" Douglas was silent for a few seconds, as if searching for words, and finally looked up. "It was accidental," he answered with bitterness in his voice. "I knew her as a local girl. Saved her once from some bullies in the park. After that, we started hanging out, just as friends at first. I knew it was wrong, but she reached out to me and I felt needed." "Needed?" Lily interjected, barely raising an eyebrow, a faint shadow of disgust flickering across her face. "Needed? Do you realize she was underage?" "I do," Douglas sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I realize it now. And what's more, I realized it then. It's just—" He stopped, apparently unable to find an excuse. I tried to stop it. "You know, when she told me she was pregnant, I was scared. I wanted us to split up. Hoped it was just that she wouldn't wait for me." "You wanted to leave her?" Tom stepped forward, his gaze now stern and unforgiving. "What was your plan, Douglas? Leave her alone, pregnant, and hope she'd just disappear?" Douglas turned sharply toward him, barely containing his anger. "You think I don't realize how that sounds? Yes, I was scared, and yes, I didn't know what to do, but I wasn't going to kill her." His voice was full of despair. He looked exhausted, like he was trying to justify himself. "So you deny seeing her the day she died?" Lily kept her eyes on his face, her gaze penetrating to the very bottom. "No." Douglas took a deep breath. "I saw her then, it's true. She came to the station, wanted to talk, but I didn't want to discuss it. Said we couldn't go on. She left, and that was the last time I saw her. I don't know anything else." Lily stared at him in silence, her gaze remaining cold and professional, but inside her thoughts swirled around his words. She felt that there was still some detail missing from his story, as if he were hiding something. Maybe not the murder itself, but something important. Tom leaned over to Lily and whispered, "We have more evidence. Footprints in the warehouse and pieces of fabric from his uniform. That confirms that he was there at the crime scene." Lily nodded and then looked at Douglas with a new, even more piercing look. "Douglas, do you know what we found in the warehouse where we discovered Casey's body?" She paused to let him feel the gravity of the moment. "We found shoe impressions that matched yours, and pieces of fabric that you know were left over from your uniform." Douglas's face turned pale. He struggled to remain calm, but it was clear that he realized the trap he was in. "Look," he said at last, looking down at the floor again. "Yes, I was at the warehouse and I met Casey there, but that day, I wasn't there the day she died." Douglas sat across from the detectives, his face remaining stony. He struggled to remain calm, even as Lily Carter and Tom Garcia repeatedly presented him with evidence. "You do realize, Douglas, that we have enough to charge you," Lily began, crossing her arms and staring at him intently. "It wasn't just your uniform fibers that were left in the warehouse where Casey's body was found. We also found traces of your shoes and a bloody fingerprint of yours." Douglas sighed, a look of weariness on his face. He had explained his story to them more than once, and he knew that with each new detail his story looked more and more suspicious. "I already told you what happened," he said calmly, though his voice sounded depressed. "Yes, we were in the warehouse. Yeah, we had a fight. Casey, she pushed me, and I pushed her back. She hit her head, cut herself, yes, but it was just a cut. I helped her up and then I got dirty in her blood. But after that, I left. She was alive. I left the warehouse and I never saw her again." Tom frowned, glancing at Lily, who seemed absorbed in thought. "Douglas, do you realize that we have a hard time believing that story?" Tom said with pressure. "You were alone there, and after your quarrel, she turned up dead. The blood, the footprints, everything points to you. What if you were just scared? What if you realized you'd gone too far and decided to cover your tracks?" Douglas clenched his fists, his voice trembling, but his gaze remained steady. "No, Tom, I didn't kill her. She was alive when I left her, though she was angry with me. But she left on her own. I can swear to that." Lily, deep in thought, looked at Douglas again. "You do realize that now we have evidence not only that you were involved in her pregnancy, but also that you met at the warehouse," she said. "However, one point still doesn't add up. You weren't in the warehouse that night?" "No," Douglas answered confidently. "It was still daylight when I left. I never went back there again." Lily thought about it, her thoughts returning to the words of Hannah, Casey's friend, who had once mentioned that the girl sometimes went to the warehouse at night when she wanted to be alone. That detail had seemed inconsequential to her at the time, but now, as she listened to Douglas's words, it came back to her mind. She exchanged a glance with Tom. Their thoughts were interrupted by Hannah, who stood in the doorway, shuffling uncertainly from foot to foot. She looked worried, but determined. "Can I talk to you?" she asked, looking directly at Lily. "Hannah, we think you've already told us everything you know," Tom replied, glaring at Lily, clearly signaling that time was running out. "No, it's important," Hannah insisted, her voice oddly insistent. "I have the password to Casey's cloud storage. There's a video you need to see." Lily and Tom looked at each other, exchanging a moment's silent agreement. If there really is information related to the case in that vault, it needs to be checked out. "Okay, come on, show us," Lily nodded, not taking her eyes off Hannah's face, which showed relief and confusion at the same time. Hannah walked over to their computer and entered the password into Casey's cloud storage. Soon a list of files appeared on the screen, among which one video was marked. Lily and Tom looked at it silently and, without hesitation, clicked play. Casey appeared on the screen. She was sitting on the cold concrete floor of the warehouse, her face illuminated by the dim light. Her gaze seemed tired but determined, and her voice was a little uncertain, as if she were speaking to someone she couldn't see. "Douglas," she began, and her eyes glittered with a moist gleam. "I know you probably think I'm just a child, that you should leave, but you don't understand. You're the only one who means anything to me." Casey sighed heavily, her hand trembling as she brought the cigarette to her lips. "You always said we couldn't be together," she continued, looking straight into the camera. "But you don't understand. I can't be without you. The baby. I want him to be a part of both of us, to know who his father is." With those words, she took another sip from the bottle beside her, and her eyes closed for a moment, as if from fatigue or regret. "They don't understand anything. No one understands. I'll do anything to keep us together," she whispered, looking away as if she could see her and Douglas's future in her imagination. She was about to stand up but swayed, her heel catching on a piece of rebar on the floor. The camera captured her terrified expression and then flew down, falling screen down. The video continued for a few seconds in the darkness before the screen turned off, leaving the detectives in silence. Lily and Tom, looking at the black screen, didn't seem to immediately realize what had happened. The video was revealing not only Casey's inner state, but also her final moments. Now, they could see the whole picture. "It was an accident," Lily whispered, not looking away from the screen, as if she couldn't believe what she had just seen. Tom nodded, and his face grew heavy, as if he were trying to process what he'd just seen. "She may not have meant to die," he said quietly. "But that video shows how unstable she was. She went in there alone, and what happened happened. Now they had answers. Tragic, painful, but definitive. After weeks of investigation, sleepless nights, and agonizing trials, the Casey Reed case was closed. Evidence gathered from the warehouse and video from cloud storage showed that her death was a tragic accident. Douglas Harris was acquitted, and his name was officially cleared of suspicion. But a trace of the story remained, and it was deeper than it might at first appear. Douglas stood at the window of his rented apartment, watching the early morning spill over the city streets. Until a few weeks ago, it had seemed to him that this was his home, a place where he knew every corner, every street, and every person. Now everything seemed alien, as if this city had rejected him, as if his memories had been stained by this tragedy. His colleagues at the station didn't speak to him directly, but he could feel the looks they were giving him. They knew about his connection to Casey, knew he'd broken that very oath to serve the law and morality. Even Sam, his friend, looked at him differently, not with judgment, but with a disappointment and sadness that was especially hard for Douglas to see. Sam had dropped by the night before, as Douglas was packing. "Are you leaving?" he asked, leaning against the door jamb. Douglas nodded, avoiding his friend's gaze. He felt like the words were stuck in his throat, and he couldn't find anything to say. How to explain the fact that he had ruined everything? How do you convey that he'd lost not only his future, but his self-respect? "Do you realize that you'll still be in the memory of this town?" Sam asked quietly, as if a parting rebuke. "We'll all remember Casey, and with her, you." Douglas nodded silently, and Sam walked out, leaving him in silence. As he drove away the next day, Douglas took one last look at the sunlit streets. Here in this city, he had lost everything he was and everything he could be. He realized that he was taking with him not only the memory of Casey, but also a heavy sense of guilt that would accompany him for the rest of his life. Getting into the car, he didn't look back.